This morning, we're going to talk about beyond the Modern Slavery Act. The Prime Minister has pledged £33 million to fight slavery. So what are the next steps and what more can be done in the fight against slavery? And we're joined by an extraordinary panel, and there'll be some opportunities later to ask some questions. I'm joined by Kevin Hyland, the United Kingdom's first anti-slavery commissioner. He leads the efforts to tackle slavery and human trafficking. He promotes best practice and drives change. And it was interesting, last month in the annual report on his current strategic plan, he gave his very first priority as victim identification and care. Kevin was the head of the Met's Human Trafficking Unit and a policeman for 30 years. He's been awarded the OBE for services to combating human trafficking. Kevin Hyland. Then we have Parosha Chandran, who is a leading anti-slavery and human rights barrister at One Pump Court Chambers. Her work has significantly shaped laws and policy and set legal precedents and impacted thousands of lives. Last year, she received the Trafficking in Persons Hero Award from the United States Secretary of State John Kerry, who praised her tireless efforts to develop and advance national and international laws and policy on human trafficking, and her unwavering commitment to protecting victims. Parosha Chandran. Next we have Klara Skrivankova, who is an expert on modern slavery and human trafficking. She is also Anti-Slavery International's own United Kingdom and Europe programme lead. She's been an expert witness internationally. She holds and has held numerous advisory roles on very key bodies like the Ethical Trade Initiative, the EU Expert Group on the Trafficking of Human Beings, and the UN Voluntary Trust on Contemporary Slavery. She also writes and speaks on the issues, and she co-founded the UK Trafficking Law and Policy Forum. That's Klara. And at the end there is James Ewins QC, who's been a tireless campaigner for the last 9 years, bringing his personal passion and his own legal expertise to slavery and the fair treatment of workers. He was instrumental in lobbying Cadbury on becoming fair trade, and he worked on the ground in Bangalore securing the release of bonded labour. James advised the Joint Select Committee on the Modern Slavery Bill. He also, and this is his main area of expertise, wrote the Independent Review on Overseas Domestic Workers. And this year, James was awarded a British Citizen Award in recognition of his work against slavery. That's James Ewins. So just to begin, I'm going to ask each of our panel members for a few minutes on what are the principal challenges now for Britain tackling modern slavery. And let's start with you, Kevin.
Thank you. Good morning. And firstly, can I thank Anti-Slavery for inviting me here today and to be amongst such a good panel. I think now we've got legislation. Obviously, there's elements of that that need to be tested, need to be used more widely, need to be have lawyers and barristers who are going to push it to its limits, so that we can actually see how robust it is. But what is behind all of the issues when we talk about modern slavery? I'm just going to talk over the next few minutes about 3 particular issues, but at the heart of them, on each one, are victims and the care of victims and how we stop people becoming victims, or when they do become victims, we look after them and give them world-class service. The Prime Minister has called this the greatest human rights issue of our time. She has personally led on this, set up a task force, but now we need to see things delivered. Words come, actions need to follow. So I'm going to talk about some of the things I've raised. If you've seen my report, I've mentioned about crime recording and the fact that over the last year there were over 3,000 victims recorded and entered into the National Referral Mechanism, which is the government's funded programme for supporting victims. Yet there were only 884 of those that were recorded by police, and then of those there were far fewer that were investigated, as I would call it, efficiently and effectively. But if I tell you some of the things that are missed in that process, things like a 13-year-old boy who is trafficked across Europe, manages to escape into the UK, but he was trafficked for his organs. And that person, yes, they were supported. Yes, they ended up in a scheme in the UK through what is part of the NRM, but is childcare safeguarding. but nobody was looking for those who were committing these crimes. Nobody was looking to stop them doing it again. So how do we know unless we're getting that right? And also, if things aren't recorded as crimes, victims cannot get compensation through criminal injuries compensation, which is difficult enough. They are not open or available to use reparation in the Modern Slavery Act, and they will struggle to get benefits. The next thing is the NRM itself, and I'm asking that to be reviewed. The National Referral Mechanism, I think, doesn't do what it should do. It is set down in European directives and Council of Europe conventions as a 30-day project or process. The UK gives 45 days. My concern is, when we brought this in, this was a European Council of Europe convention for countries that had nothing for victims. And if we look at where we are with victims of domestic abuse, victims of other violent crime, sexual abuse, we've kind of latched onto something that does less than the other things do. And we've used that. It's very expensive. It does work for some victims, but so many fall off the system. And if it isn't actually being used as well to actually prevent other victims being created and prevention, then I think it's ineffective. So I'm, over the next year, going to really look at that, or over a shorter period, and I've made that a priority for the Prime Minister's task force, so that we need to look at that, do what's right for the victims. But my next part that I'm going to talk about is international. And the reason I do a lot of work internationally is we need to stop this crime happening. And that needs three ways of doing it, really. We need to go to countries where people are trafficked from. If we look at Nigeria, and I've done a lot of work on Nigeria, at the moment, the migrant crisis, the biggest percentage of people arriving into Italy are from Nigeria, mainly women and girls. The IOM has recently reported that 50% of those show 2 indicators of being trafficked, 70% of them show 1 indicator of being trafficked. And up to the first 6 months of this year, there were 6,000 women and girls in that number. And we know that 80% of those were destined for exploitation in Europe, many in the UK. So we need to work in countries where this is happening. And that's about 3 things: giving development opportunities to address the causes, so to give job opportunities, let them develop in their own countries so that the criminals aren't there pulling them away. Rule of law, so good governance, working with those countries to ensure that they've got ways of working. And then community engagement, so that the message of prevention is getting there. So I think that we need to do those things, development in these countries, so that we do away with the draw factors that actually end up with people in modern slavery. So everything that I do is about victims, prevention of victims, being created as victims. Once they are actually in the system as victims, we need to do everything we can to support them properly and to bring to justice those who commit these horrendous crimes. So that's me in a few minutes, and I look forward to your questions.
Lots of challenges there, particularly international development as well at the moment. Parosha, you're right in the heart of the legal system, both here and internationally. What do you regard as the challenges? We have the legislation, but what now?
Thank you, Karen. Well, what the Modern Slavery Act principally did was consolidate existing trafficking legislation that was contained in lots of different pieces of legislation. It built on that as well in some ways by including the Transparency in Supply Chains clause, which requires companies to publish a statement to say what steps they're taking to find and eradicate slavery in their supply chains. But there are some very significant gaps in the legislation if we look at it now. Number one, I would say, is that we need to criminalise more slavery and trafficking related conduct. At the moment, if someone commits forced labour or slavery in the UK, they are subject to the force of the criminal law. But if a British person goes overseas or uses subcontractors overseas to force migrant workers, for example, or somebody into household slavery in their homes overseas, there is no reach of the criminal law. So one of the things that I think is very important is to start looking at expanding extraterritorial jurisdiction for the crimes of forced labour and slavery. The need to amend legislation is nothing new when it comes to slavery. When we look historically at the very acts of Parliament that were able to bring down the transatlantic slave trade, that were inspired by the Anti-Slavery Society, of which you're all now the modern members. What we saw was that the first slave trade prohibition was by way of a fine. So if somebody traded a slave, then they would be whacked with a fine. It was £1,000 at that time. It was very quickly recognised that that wasn't a sufficient deterrent. And so the next Slave Trade Act came in to change it from a fine to a crime. So the crime of slavery was then developed through legislation and through the operation of legislation, recognising that there were gaps. It was then recognised that the crime in itself is not, again, sufficient deterrent. You need to have very good sentencing. And so it was then that the next Slave Trade Act brought in the death penalty for slave trading, which was then quickly, though, changed to the sentence of transportation, which some of you may or may not know was actually sending somebody to a penal colony for life. So that's just to give you a flavour. We shouldn't be worried or think we're doing something wrong by asking for amendments to legislation on slavery. We're only dealing with modern slavery now, properly, with our eyes wide open, recognising what the deficits are. And so one of the things, as I say, is that, for example, if a British company uses migrant workers on construction sites in the Gulf states, as you've read about so frequently, for the building of certain sports stadiums, and forces those workers into labour, forced labour conditions, imposes debt bondage, abuses their position of vulnerability once they're there, to change the contract terms and to give them little or no pay and keep them in squalid conditions, then whilst the money can filter back to the British company, because the company is based here in terms of the example that I'm talking about, it's filtering back crime-free. So the hands of the company are clean because there isn't extraterritorial jurisdiction to say that the knowing use of forced labour and slavery abroad is a crime.
And Parosha, is that the first thing that you would say is the most urgent amendment?
I think so, because I think what we're seeing is Thai fishing slavery. We're seeing fishermen, not just in the Thai industry, but in other industries, being thrown overboard when they become useless because they're just exhausted from the work they're doing. We're seeing the growth and the drive of corporations to make more and more money. And clearly the environment that we're about to experience may even start to emphasise that more. So there needs to be accountability for corporations in particular, unless there is direct criminal responsibility under law for corporations. It's going to be difficult for just the Transparency in Supply Chains clause, which has no bite legally other than an injunction if one hasn't made that statement, to be an effective deterrent and to start companies thinking, if I don't stop this, what will happen?
Okay, well, let me bring Klara in on that, because Klara's done so much work on supply chains, amongst many other things. Klara, what would you pick up on that?
I certainly agree with Parosha on that point, but I think what we really need to be looking at is the big picture. What we have before us is a fantastic opportunity. We have new legislation, and it's 3 pieces of new legislation, in fact, across the 3 jurisdictions in the UK. We've got a great momentum, we've got a high political priority, which is something that we haven't had for a very long time. Slavery hasn't been a high political priority. It was always worked on, but it wasn't a priority. So we've got the momentum, we've got the focus, and we've got the funding that's coming in. So that's a great opportunity, and it's going to be more and more important for organizations like Anti-Slavery and others who are there to work on protecting human rights to be present in the current world. But I also see a bit of a risk in this great opportunity, and that's that, people might think, well, we now have legislation, so job is done, or we have talked about modern slavery, everybody knows about modern slavery, therefore there is no need to work intensively on it anymore. There might also be a pressure to produce quick results, progress. And while it would be nice to get quick results, what we need to be aware of is that the nature of the problem requires sustained efforts over a long period of time. So we can't just be satisfied by getting increased numbers of prosecutions, although that's very important milestones, or increased number of victims identified, again, a very important milestones. But as Kevin has said, how many of the victims that were identified were given compensation, access to compensation? Very few. And what we also need to be really focusing on is how do we make the transition from a situation of exploitation to situations where people get access to decent work. Decent work here in the UK, but also globally. What we need to be then looking at is the underlying causes and consequences. Why do some people are so at risk of being exploited? Why do British and other companies decide to subcontract and source from countries where there is people who are disempowered, who are prevented from access to power, and that makes them more at risk of slavery? So we need to focus on the empowerment and upholding the human rights. So while we absolutely have to address the individual cases that we come across, we also need to look at the big picture and the systemic issues, the policies, the practices, and the insufficient legislation that make this possible. And finally, what we all need to be thinking about is we cannot do this alone, and that's why we pride ourselves in anti-slavery on working in partnerships globally across the globe, but also here in the UK, because no one organization, no one institution can do this alone. And what we have to be very mindful of is we have to be working on this as a part of the European Union, or with the European Union, with the European structures that are there. The European Convention, the European Directive are there to protect victims, and we really need to make sure that we remain part of that, and that we also get access to the powers that the police have had to carry transnational and European actions against traffickers. So we need to be mindful that we need to be part of a bigger block of efforts to deal with human trafficking and modern slavery.
We mustn't forget the B word, Brexit, which we'll come back to shortly, and obviously we're all very keen to know the perspective on what will happen. But James, you advised on the Modern Slavery Act, you advised on the legislation, you also wrote the review of overseas domestic workers. What do you think is the most important issue that we need to tackle immediately?
I've actually got very little to add to what's been said already. Because it's been said so well and so comprehensively. The piece of legislation, the Modern Slavery Act, was conceived over 2 or 3 years. It took up the last term of Parliament, and it was astonishing that it all happened so quickly. The research began in 2011, and by 2015 we had an act. That's unprecedented. But I entirely endorse the views, particularly that Parosha has mentioned. We do not leave it there as a piece of static legislation. That would be wrong. Parosha has already referred to some examples in the 19th century when the anti-slavery movement then used progressive steps to achieve what it wanted to achieve. And if one looks slightly longer term, it was 1807 that we had the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. It wasn't until 1833 that we had abolition of slavery itself across the British Empire. That's 26 years. The Act was passed last year. We need to be in this for the long term, and we need to be consistently reflecting back. How is the law working? How is it not working? Where are the areas that we have missed? We must stay vigilant. I entirely endorse, and if it were my number one point, I would pick up on the last point that was made by Klara. That is working together. It's absolutely clear, and has become absolutely clear over the years that I've been involved, that there is no one organisation that can do this alone. We need to be people on the front line delivering services. We need to be people advocating with a voice in Parliament. We need to have a voice in the European Union. We need to have a voice in the international community, in the UN and the ILO. We need to be across the piece talking about this and maintaining the unique opportunity of a high profile that we have at the moment. I think in the area that I was particularly involved in the last year, the overseas domestic worker visa, it's seeing it through to completion. It's the same theme. We start with the government saying, well, here's a bit of a way to avoid the fact we all disagree with this and we'll just have an independent review.
James, perhaps not everyone understands precisely what the situation with those visas is at the moment.
Then I will summarise it very quickly. The position with regard to visas, overseas domestic workers, people that come from third countries, predominantly Southeast Asia, go to work for other people who then come to the UK and want to bring their domestic staff with them. To do that, they get an overseas domestic worker visa, and there are about 16 to 17,000 such visas issued every year. The government changed the law in 2012 and said of those overseas domestic workers, you will be tied to your employer. You cannot work for anyone else. That was quite rightly an issue of huge contention as the bill went through Parliament, and the final resolution was not that the government would change its position, but that it would offer an independent review, and it offered that to me. Unsurprisingly, my view was you should not be tying overseas domestic workers to their employers, and the government took up that recommendation. Nobody is tied. What they didn't do was take up what I felt was the necessary corollary, which was to extend the term of a visa. If somebody comes to the UK, they're given 6 months. If they want to leave their employer during that time, as they all now can, so it is no longer a tied visa, the only people who get an extension of the 6 months are those who successfully go through the NRM. Kevin has identified the problems with the NRM. Even if it were working perfectly, that would deal only with those people whose exploitation meets that threshold. And in one sense, when Kevin and I discussed this several months ago, that's a tick for Kevin's box. Kevin is the anti-slavery commissioner. That's what he needs. My ambit was slightly broader, and therefore I'm looking at people whose exploitation falls short of the definition of slavery, and they're not covered. So that's an area where the government isn't even attempting to take on my recommendation, but in all the other areas it's just taken quite a bit of time.
And on that, Kevin, just to come back to the national referral mechanism, because this is a very important point, that while we have mechanisms, they don't necessarily all work, and we must all work together to make them work. You mentioned that at the beginning. Just before we go on to ask you all what you think about the changing political environment and the changing Brexit and the changes in America. Just on the national referral mechanism, how can we ensure that, for example, what you said, of the 3,000 people who were referred, only 800 were actually recorded as crimes? And correct me if I'm wrong, but there is only a very limited amount of help that people get, even if they are referred to the national referral mechanism. So what can we actually do? What can we all do to ensure that changes? Because there are so many more people coming and so many more people being trafficked.
Sure, and I think there is success because there are more people being identified. It sounds odd, but that means more people are coming forward and being identified by the different agencies. However, what the problem is that the system is there and it's very much a process. Part of the decisions, if you're EU national and know my immigration issues, the decision is made by the National Crime Agency. If you have immigration issues, it's made by UK Visa and Immigration. So, in effect, an organisation whose raison d'etre is to remove people from the UK. So they will be looking through it through not a lens of being a victim, but through a lens of administration and removal. So it sits in the wrong place at the moment. I think that should all be done by professionals who have expertise in exclusively slavery and vulnerability of people. So that then, when these decisions are made, they are looking and setting a pathway on how the victim is going to be supported, can make decisions. Now, a lot of victims will not want to engage with the authorities, quite understandably, particularly if they come from countries where corruption is rife. However, they still have to engage with the authorities because it's the National Crime Agent and Visa and Immigration who are making the decisions through a very odd lens. So it needs to be something that's far more professional. One thing that I did make recommendations in my report was around the way law enforcement pick up and evaluate and manage and mine the NRM data without having to draw on the victims. And there has been a £8.5 million put forward now, so the police will have an intelligence hub and will look at all the NRM data and nationally look at that data so they can be more proactive about how they can prevent the victims being exploited, how they can actually identify them, and then how they can work upstream in countries of origin. But what I want to see is the NRM is a process which is run by professionals from healthcare, from people who've got expertise with victims of modern slavery, children's care, local authorities, and when the victims enter into that, they're not just looking at the process, are they or aren't they a victim under the convention, they're saying what is the pathway for that person, and then how do we monitor them through their whole process, either through the criminal justice system or through healthcare, or just being diverted into a good job, as we've heard, and actually becoming a part of a community. And there is also a number of victims want to go home. But it's not good enough to give them a ticket and say get to Luton Airport or go to Victoria bus station. It needs to be managed so that when they return home, something is in place like would happen here. So they're not actually then subject of re-trafficking. And I've been to Vietnam, I've been to Nigeria, and there are projects operating there. In Nigeria, there's a very successful project for people who return from Italy and Germany and other parts of Europe. They haven't had a single person return from the UK, even though there are some people who do want to go back to their parents, to their mothers and fathers. But if people want to stay here and need that support, James and I agreed on one thing, that 2 years in some cases for victims of modern slavery is not enough. The rest of their life might not be enough. And those people need to be supported in the UK for as long as it takes. But the NRM at the moment is a process, it's very ABC, it needs to look at individuals and be tailored to and bespoke to the individual's needs.
You've all stressed in one form or another about the need for cooperation, and in all of your work, all of you, you've worked internationally. We have a different international environment now. We've had the Brexit vote, and now we have a different policy direction in the United States of America. What do you think the effect of that is? I mean, perhaps you work in Europe predominantly as for anti-slavery, Klara. Perhaps you could start, and then Parosha, perhaps you could pick up on that with your work in America.
I think what we need to really focus on is international and European law that we have. The fact that we have voted for Brexit doesn't mean that we are not bound by the Council of Europe Convention on Trafficking, and we will probably still be bound by the EU Directive on Trafficking. And I think we need to remember that it's not just the European law, but it's also the international human rights law. And it will be really a task for all of us, but especially for the lawyers who are day in, day out in courts defending that. And we need to make sure that the protections that are there at the moment for victims, but also the enablers that are there for international cooperation, including a cooperation in prosecution and policing, remain. Because they are there, and we should make sure that they remain and that we have access to them. So that's an important thing. And recently we were co-hosting a conference together with the Garden Court Chambers and the Human Trafficking Foundation, and this very point was made by Fiona McTaggart MP, and she called on all of us to sort of look at what are the critical points that we need to make sure are part of the negotiations. Because that's something that must not be forgotten. Because human trafficking and victims of trafficking are unlikely to be at the center of the Brexit negotiation, but we need to make sure that they are included and that the protections that exist are not dismantled.
And these are very legal points. So, Parosha, what?
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll just pick up on this point, and it ties in with, of course, policing. So what we've had the benefit of as a member of the European Union is Europol and cross-border investigations that have been very highly and heavily funded by Europe. So, for example, some years ago, there was a spate of thefts, volume thefts on the underground. And what it was found by the Met Police was that these thefts of mobile phones, of handbags, so many going missing all the time, being stolen, were being conducted by Roma children. And they were being brought up at Horseferry Magistrates Court. And one girl had actually obtained 100 convictions before the police then thought, hang on a sec, what is behind this? There must be an organisation behind this. This child's not got the, will or why is this happening? So they then started to investigate. they linked with the Romanian police. And this was the first Eurojust investigation. It was called Operation Gulf. And it was very important to have the two countries in conjunction, not only to be able to share information and to be able to evidentially track what was happening, but because in Romania they have a criminal law against membership of an organised criminal group, which we didn't in England, and that would have enabled very stiff sentences to be obtained. At the end of Operation Gulf, I mean, there were many convictions, something like 20 or 30 convictions were shared between Romania and the UK, and they brought down this trafficking network. But it's just an example of how important the EU's influence has been on combating human trafficking and slavery. And what Fiona McTaggart said at this particular event was that there has been no consideration as to what the outcomes are going to be from a modern slavery perspective and the policing of modern slavery. Now, it's one thing for Britain to, frankly, crow about being a world leader in combating human trafficking and slavery. But if the Brexit model is to slam down the borders shut, then we're nothing more than an insular country that will have no influence on anyone other than ourselves. So it's something very important.
And just, James, could you just maybe bring together, you are not just a QC, but you are a hands-on activist as well. So how does somebody who wants to help in this fight affect the legal discussion that needs to be had about what is kept and what is lost in Brexit?
Again, I come back to the last point I was making, which is about the number of organisations that need to be united around this. This is a point where we can actually draw on something that's happened on the other side of the pond in the last few days, where after a shocking electoral result, people have said, actually, we have to work together. Now, we're in the opposite position. We are in an amazing opportunity here. As Klara said, it's a unique opportunity. We need to work together in this context. We need to inform each other. We need to be giving consistent messages to government, who will be going through this whole Brexit exercise over the coming months, probably years, and we need to make sure this stays on the agenda. The other thing we need to do is make sure that we are drawing on empirical, evidence-based information. There are organisations who walk with individuals through their cases. We heard, as Parosha was saying, about Operation Gulf. How did that even begin? Because somebody watched that girl and learnt something from her experience, kept that information, that understanding, that intelligence, and used it to inform what has become a number of international investigations since then. But that was the key. So we need to get behind those organisations who are right next to, walking with individual victims who have been identified, understand their story, understand the phenomenon that were brought to bear to bring about their victimisation, learn from that, and use that to inform our policy advice.
Brilliant. And speaking of messages, I forgot to mention that if anyone is tweeting, the hashtag is Freedom Conference. Now, let's just open this up now, because obviously we want to hear from you, and I'm sure you have questions for the panel after hearing what they've had to say. Is anyone got a question for anyone? Kevin or Parosha or Klara? Hi.
Hi.
Do you want to say who you are?
Yeah, my name is Paul Henty. I'm a partner with Charles Russell Speechlys, law firm in London. My question is, I mean, sort of talking about Brexit, and we talked a lot about challenges, but if the UK now is going to go ahead and negotiate a lot of bilateral international trade deals with countries like you mentioned Thailand, doesn't that present an opportunity for the UK to really incentivise those countries to improve their practices in relation to slavery and trafficking? And isn't it really a huge open door? Because, I mean, obviously getting access to government ministries to talk about Brexit at the moment is difficult, but the International Trade Ministry can't negotiate deals for 2 years until Article 50 has been properly completed. And isn't there really an open goal there to talk to that ministry and say, you really need to be thinking about slavery and trafficking before you're concluding deals with countries like Thailand?
Can I just put that to Kevin, because you do have access, and your position gives you a certain...
Yeah, so thank you, Paul. It's a very sensible question, very apt, really. So some of the things that I've been doing, I've been working very much with the UN. We were very much involved in getting a sustainable development goal. So we've now got 197 countries who have signed up to the eradication of modern slavery. That meant then that we've now got DFID, who are now putting money forward. I've met with Priti Patel and the head of programming for DFID, and we've got lots of things that are going to be developed, and I think over the coming months we will see DFID playing a major role in this area. But also, I think, covering as well what Parosha said, she's absolutely right about us having, extraterritorial powers, but I'm working with the Bali process, which covers 45 countries in the Southeast Asian area, chaired by Australia and by Indonesia. But we want them to get legislation like ours, because actually, how are we going to sustain going out and investigating crimes on the other side of the world and then prosecuting them in Southwark Crown Court?
It can be done under the Bribery Act, can't it?
It can be done,
So
it can be done, but
it.
I'm talking about, the Bribery Act is money. This is lives of people. And
More important,
yeah,
isn't it?
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. But we need countries themselves, like Australia, like Indonesia, like Malaysia, we need to actually encourage them to have legislation as well. The extraterritorial powers are there for a British citizen who commits crimes of trafficking elsewhere. So they can be prosecuted if they move people for trafficking.
Only move them from the UK outside, not somebody outside the UK.
The
Well,
point
no,
that
there's-
you're
there's
making
gotta be
there
some
about,
UK connection,
about
but-
the Bribery Act is it is possible to have legislation.
But what we don't want is, so I'm also working with the G20, the B20, so those negotiations when there are trade deals. I've been to Vietnam, I've seen how British companies are influencing there, worked with UK trade and industry over there, and how they are influencing an enormous amount of culture there. And some of our companies there are doing some of the best training of communities, so that then they've got thousands of ambassadors who will go out to the communities and say to their friends and relatives, this is what being a good employer should be. Now, none of this, and I think everyone agrees, is done overnight. This is the long haul. I've also met with all the G6, and recently when I was at the UN, I met with some of the presidents and prime ministers from around the world who are all very keen in about how they can start to introduce legislation looking at the UK. So I think that we need to encourage other countries. We need to actually make sure that people are being protected in those countries. We know that, most countries in the world have got some form of legislation. However, it's not really effective in those countries because of other issues like corruption. The last thing as well is that, for example, companies like Unilever bought out industries knowing that there was slavery and exploitation in them. And their aim was to get rid of it. And if it was an offence for them to buy those, they wouldn't have bought them. I want to see some of our companies taking that risk, going into the industries where there is risk, and then pushing it out and start giving people opportunities. I'm working in Assam at the moment. There's 500,000 people in Assam today in exploitation in modern day slavery. Some of our biggest companies are trading there and they want to work to raise the wages there. It's the political situation there.
It's like the tea industry, yeah.
That won't let them raise the wages. It's there. It's in the country. But our companies want to work politically with the British Asian Trust, with the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association to try and influence it, because all it is 50 pence a day pay rise, and those people will be out of exploitation. That would add something like 0.005 to every packet of tea, so it wouldn't affect us at all. That's the way I'd like to see
Let me
a change.
just bring in James and then Parosha on the same point.
I think it is a unique opportunity. We had the Prime Minister out in India very recently, who is gagging for a trade deal. But if you're going to bring in an international dimension to transparency in the supply chain, bring in equivalent legislation overseas, it's got to be win-win. Otherwise, the foreign government, just as Kevin has said, the problem there is not that the UK company doesn't want to have to eliminate slavery from its supply chain in, for example, Assam. It's just that there's a huge political movement in India saying, well, if you raise their wages, then we've got to raise everyone's wages. What's that going to do to our economy? The transparency in supply chain only just made it into the Modern Slavery Act. At the very last minute, there was resistance, and where did it come from? business, innovation and skills. They didn't want the red tape. So it had to be sold as a win-win. That's why it's got no teeth, because the moment it had teeth, it would never have got in. But it's got in with no teeth. Now we can give it teeth. That's how you've got to play it. So it's got to be some very careful, astute trade negotiations that present equivalent legislation in us effectively putting a condition on a trade deal that there are humanitarian conditions, that there is equivalent legislation and enforcement of that legislation. It's got to be done carefully, and it may well be that it's done very slow and very small at the beginning, but it gives us something to work on.
We're zooming along here, Parosha. I know you have a line, but we have another question over here. So what's your...
Yes, a question for the lawyers. Although I gather it's not enforced very much, I understand that the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution makes goods which are produced in whole or part by slaves contraband or illegal. Does anyone know if there's any equivalent domestic provision in either the UK or any other European country?
Klara has actually been advising on this. So
Did you all hear that question? Yeah.
Could you please repeat the question?
Yes, so it was about the 13th Amendment in the United States Constitution, which makes the
procurement.
Yeah, Klara.
It's actually, yeah, there's the legislation in the US. It's the Tariff Act, and as it was amended, that makes it prohibits the importation of goods that have been in part or fully produced by forced labor to the US. And it's been there since the 1930s, but there was a gap that was closed this year. So in fact, if you import something to the US and there is a concern, so if I, let's say, ordered a cargo of cotton from Uzbekistan and I know it's coming, I can petition the US Customs and they'll seize the cargo and start an investigation. And it's been done now a number of times, and it's quite effective because it has teeth. You know, you're not able to import that. We in fact tried to put that very amendment into the Modern Slavery Act. Baroness Young of Hornsey and quite a few others in the House of Lords were very much in support of that, because it would be one of the enablers to ensure that this is not just a incentive on transparency. It's also something that sends a very clear message that we are not in the business of trading in slavery-produced goods. Unfortunately, it hasn't made it into the Modern Slavery Act, but as James had said, yet it's something that can come and hopefully, well, we certainly will be continuing to work on that. But actually, thank you for that question, because one thing that we have been highlighting as an organization is that slavery and issues of anti-slavery should be included in international trade. It is as much an issue of international trade as it is of human rights. And you can see the effectiveness of pressure in trade relations that have, for example, yielded progress in Thailand. When the EU have given a yellow card on trade from Thailand, the Thai government started to listen. And there is still a risk that a red card might be used if the progress isn't as quick as we expect it to be. So it's very important, and there is a huge incentive, and you can certainly use those incentives. But as James has said, you need to be quite careful where and when you are in a position to actually use those incentives. But on a positive note, while the Modern Slavery Act doesn't really have teeth in the way we would like it to have on the transparency and supply chain provision, it has generated a debate and ripples that are unprecedented. Yeah. I know that suppliers in India want to know what they need to be doing. Mm-hmm. So there are discussions already going on, and I think that's something to capitalize on. And it's certainly something that the UK embassies around the world are in position to support and provide platforms for British businesses. And in fact, I've been just talking to the British embassy in Thailand a few weeks ago about that very point, because British businesses want to make sure that along the supply chain, their suppliers are aware and make improvements and support. The good businesses want to support their suppliers in getting better.
Yes, I'm just going to bring in another suggestion for innovation, which we were trying to get in under the Modern Slavery Act, which is to introduce a civil remedies clause for trafficking and slavery, which would mean that even if a company was benefiting from slavery or trafficking overseas, the claimant could bring a case against the British company. And this is something that arises from the TVPRA 2003. It's an American amending piece of legislation. They started with their Trafficking Victim Protection Act in 2000, TVPA. By 2003, they realized that in order for there to be greater incentive to anybody to refrain from trafficking and slavery, they needed to help victims bring compensation claims. And so the TVPRA, the Trafficking Victim Protection Reauthorization Act 2003, includes a clause which is to allow a remedy against anyone who knowingly benefits financially or by receiving anything of value from participation in a venture which that person knew or should have known has engaged in an act of trafficking or forced labour. Now, so I had asked anti-slavery for their opinion on whether or not they would support a civil remedies clause under the Modern Slavery Act. And we tried to, as I say, have debates on that, and there were debates on it, but it was left on the back burner and not enacted. But it's something that, again, we're giving force to at the moment. What we're seeing in America is that companies and individuals who would otherwise not be successfully held accountable for the actual act of forced labour or slavery in their supply chains are being successfully sued for their actions overseas under civil law. So this is something that is a very important thing to think about as another piece of amending legislation.
We don't have that much time left, but I am very keen if anyone has any questions with this panel that they get the opportunity to ask them. Is there anything else? Otherwise, we'll just carry on. Okay, great. Kevin, do you want to pick up on that? Because,
Yeah.
I mean, there seems to be a lot of extra legislation being discussed that we all have a lot of work in thinking through.
Sure.
And getting partners for, and anti-slavery as a partnership organisation above anything else. Seems like, you know, we have successes, but the challenge for the teeth, as James puts it, seems to be acute.
Sure. First of all, I totally agree with what Parosha's just suggested. I think having that would deal with the demand issue remotely is an absolutely crucial piece of legislation. I think that, where you can take that action in that sense, really makes sense. That particularly really does make sense. But I think what we've got to remember is the Modern Slavery Act only came into effect, it got royal assent in March 2015, but came into effect in August. And certain elements have only just come in this year, like the transparency in the supply chain came in 1st of April, and the high seas parts of it only recently came in. So the first cases are only just going through the courts. And, you know, the definition says knows or ought to know. Nobody's tested what ought to know means. I want it really tested. Now, ought to know might mean the director or the CEO of a big company, because they ought to know what's going on. And if somebody's informed them, and I want to see lawyers testing that, and people like James and Parosha, I'm sure will. So I think that's what needs to happen. We need to understand what the legislation is. I totally agree with everything. We need to develop it. We also need to look at the new things that are coming in, that we've got international development, which don't need legislation. We need legislation around the funding and so forth, but actually delivering a project in Nigeria or in Vietnam or in India, we can't legislate for that. We need good, on-the-ground humanitarian responses that provide development. When I've been out to Greece and Italy and to those areas, you know, I've seen lots of failings there. We need to be dealing with that. We need to be actually stopping people being trafficked and being exploited there. I'm doing work now where we're following the whole route from Africa through Nigeria. Everyone told me you couldn't work in Nigeria. We've now got relationships in Nigeria. Into Libya, we're building on relationships in Libya, where there are centres with 1,000 women in them who today will be raped. I met a 15-year-old girl who had been kept for 3 months in a house and sold every day so that she could earn enough money to get her passage across the Mediterranean. And we do need to talk about the big picture, absolutely. We have to talk about how we stop it. That's why I go to the UN. That's why I go to the Bali process. That's why I meet with presidents and prime ministers. But at the end of the day, it's lives, it's individuals. And if we forget that, we're going to forget why we're doing it. If we set a policy up that doesn't work and somebody gets trafficked or that 13-year-old boy ends up being sold for his organs, it's all been worthless. We need to make sure there are things happening and practical solutions that are developed, not in 5 years' time, but next year, in the next coming months. The delivery of a project in Nigeria could happen by the spring, could start to be developed. It would take 3 or 4 years to start working, but we could start delivering it, and then we could start seeing the reductions of numbers who are dying in the Mediterranean. But if we're just looking at policy, if we're just arguing about this act does that, that act does that, we need a bit more of this, we need action there now. When there's a fire, we don't sit down and write a policy, we get the water there and the fire engines there and put it out. And we need a response like that now. This is no longer a migrant crisis. If we look at the figures from the IOM, it's now a trafficking and modern slavery crisis. And the international response isn't responding at the speed and the power and the strength that needs to be there. And that's why I need all the prime ministers and presidents, the UN, the Bali process, the G6, the G20, all on my side, so that we can make that change. And of course, organisations working together, as we say, like anti-slavery, are essential to make that happen. But we all need to have a common aim, sometimes stop arguing about the minutiae and start delivering on the big items.
Aidan.
Thanks very much. Kevin, you've spoken very eloquently about the role of development in relation to this struggle and the humanitarian responders in relation to the struggle against slavery. But I don't know what your experience has been of the big development humanitarian agencies up until now. But my experience has been that they're not particularly well informed or engaged with these issues just yet. Do you think it's something that you might be able to use your office for in the next 12 months or so in terms of drawing together some of the big agencies to talk about fundamental issues around slavery and learn a bit more about it so that they can go out into the world and use the capacities that they have in order to actually deliver practical measures against slavery on the ground as opposed to the slavery blind, to put it as generously as possible, approaches that they're currently using?
Well, as you know, Aidan, I was asked by the previous Home Secretary, now Prime Minister, to look at those particular issues. And I've done a report that's gone to the Secretary of State for Development, Foreign Secretary and Home Secretary and the Prime Minister. And it's all about that, or there's a big section about that, because we don't put modern slavery and trafficking into our humanitarian response associated to conflict or natural disaster. And actually now we're starting to see that big issue, and that's exactly what's happening. You know, we've had criminals operating with absolute impunity in areas where conflict and natural disasters happen. And then obviously you've got people who will make decisions that they would never make in normal times. We see Syrian mothers who have come from very well established lifestyles handing their children over because they think that's the only child for their child to draw another breath. And people say to me, how can anybody ever give their child away? When I went to Calais, I had people when I came back saying, oh, who could ever give their child away? If you think your child's going to die, just like what happened in the Second World War, people gave their children away to come to the UK. They didn't want to, but they had to, because it's life or death. And so I think, yes, exactly, that's exactly what needs to happen. Those measures need to be there at the point when people are leaving those conflict and those natural disaster zones, and they're given the support, given the tools, and then given the monitoring, but looking at it about what we can do to support them and actually keep the criminals away as well. So even when I've looked at, say, Nigeria, we've got a lot of military training there, in the UK has, but nowhere in its training does it learn about modern slavery or human trafficking. It will learn about drugs, it will learn about corruption, it will learn about Boko Haram and terrorism, but not modern slavery and human trafficking. So even things like that, we need to get involved in this issue.
Can I just mention also two very important sustainable development goals that were recently promulgated. One is rule of law. That is now one of the sustainable development goals. When the law is effectively enforced, violence stops. And when violence stops, slavery stops, because slavery is violent injustice to individuals. So having a rule of law element to every development project, to my mind, is absolutely crucial. And we now have a hook to hang it on, a specific sustainable development goal. It gives us an in, it gives us a voice, a reason in any discussion globally about this issue. The other sustainable development goal refers directly to modern slavery and exploitation. And again, we mustn't lose this opportunity. It gives us a right to talk about this, a right to put it in our development thinking, our discussions and our projects. I have, for a number of years, advocated that the UK government shouldn't be giving any development aid without having an element of rule of law in there, because you end up handing money over to a regime, a country, a location, where without rule of law, you cannot be sure that it's actually going to deliver what it's meant to deliver, and those individuals who should be benefiting from it are still being repeatedly exploited and subject to violent injustice in that location if the rule of law is not enforced. So we need to bring, I love this as a lawyer, I would, but we need to bring this because it actually is a crucial underlying structure of society, and nothing that operates in a society operates without some form of rule of law.
Thanks, James. And thanks, Kevin. We're coming to the end now, but I just wanted to ask a very quick final word from Klara. Is there anything for the organisation you feel is a very important?
Well, I think it's very important to have you all here today, giving up your Saturday morning and perhaps most of the day to engage in this conversation, and that's fantastic. And I think, you know, all that has been said is fundamental, and I actually quite like to end on the point that James has just made, rule of law, because that is very crucial, and that is underpinning everything. If we have good legislation, if we have good policies, but we don't have functioning rule of law, we are not going to get very far. So I think that is a fantastic ending point, and thank you all very much.
And Parosha, any final thought?
Be brave. This is going to be a tough road ahead for all of us, I think.
If I could
And I
have...
think if everyone's collaborative and keeps the spirit, we'll be okay.
If I could have your thanks for Kevin, Parosha, Klara and James.